It was an excellent idea, Sinclair, to wire Melchior Cruiser. Do you think he will agree to fulfill our request? If he left by the first train, Zibaldus looked at his watch, he'll be here any minute. Sinclair, standing by the window, pointed to the street instead of answering. A tall, thin man was approaching them at a brisk pace. You know, sometimes our consciousness suddenly changes for just a few seconds, forcing us to see familiar everyday things in an unexpectedly new, frightening light. Does this happen to you, Sinclair? It's as if you suddenly woke up and immediately fell asleep again, but in that short, no longer than one heartbeat, something mysterious and incredibly important opened up to you. Sinclair looked at his friend carefully. What do you mean by that? What a ridiculous, fateful accident pushed me to go to the wax figure's office, Zibaldus continued. I'm too sensitive today. For example, now, watching Melchior walk towards us and his figure, as he approached, became bigger and bigger. There was something painful about it, something, how can I explain it to you? Absolutely natural, because distance, as you know, absorbs everything. Bodies, sounds, thoughts, fantasies and events. Or vice versa, we first see them tiny in the distance, and then they become bigger, everything, even those that do not have a material shell, and do not need spatial displacement. No, I can't put it into words. You know what I mean. It seems that everything is subject to the same laws. His friend nodded thoughtfully. Yes, and some events or thoughts slip out of our field of vision, as if somewhere out there is an elevation or something similar behind which they can hide. And then suddenly they jump out of their hiding place again and suddenly stand in front of us, huge, at their full height. The front door slammed, and drive. Cruiser entered the tavern. Melchior Cruiser, Christian Zibaldus Obrit, chemist Sinclair introduced them. I think I guessed where you called me, said the newcomer. The old pain of Lady Lucretia. It gave me the creeps myself when I read the name of Mohammed Darasheko in yesterday's newspaper. Have you found out anything yet? Is that him? In the middle of the unpaved market square, the tent of the wax figure's office was spread out. The last rays of the setting sun were reflected in hundreds of mirror fragments, from which the words Mr. Congo Brown represents the Oriental Panopticon of Muhammad Darasheko were composed in colorful font on the cloth roof. The canvas walls of the tent, vaguely painted with wild defiant scenes, swayed and bulged like puffed cheeks, because someone was walking and leaning against them inside. 2 wooden steps led to the entrance to the tent, next to which, under a transparent hood, stood a wax figure of a woman in a bright leotard. The pale face with glassy eyes turned smoothly, looking around at the people gathered near the tent one by one, then looked away, as if waiting for an order from a dark-skinned Egyptian sitting near the cash register, then suddenly tipped back with 3 sharp feverish jerks, so that long black hair flew up in a wave, and after a while again it slowly returned to its original position, looking hopelessly in front of itself. So that in a second it would repeat everything from the beginning. From time to time, the doll suddenly twisted her legs and arms, as if they were cramped, then abruptly threw back her head and bent back, so that her forehead touched her heels. And here's the motor that drives the mechanism responsible for these disgusting antics, Sinclair said quietly, pointing to the shiny body of the car on the other side of the entrance, from where the measured hum of the 4-stroke engine was coming. Electricity, life, yes, everything alive, yes, the Egyptian rattled and handed them a program. It starts in half an hour, yes. Do you think this monkey can really know anything about Muhammad Darasheko? Obrit asked. Melchior Cruiser was not listening. He was intently studying the program, quietly repeating aloud the numbers that particularly struck him. Magical twins Veo and Denonshire, singing What is it? Did you see them yesterday? What is it? He asked suddenly. No, Sinclair said. Live artists perform only today and... You seem to know Thomas Charnock, Lucrezia's husband, quite well, didn't you, Dr. Cruiser? Zibaldus Obrit interrupted. Of course, we have been friends for many years. Didn't you suspect that he was up to something bad with the child? Dr. Cruiser shook his head. I did notice some signs of impending mental illness in his behavior, but no one could have imagined that it would manifest itself so soon and eventually turn into complete insanity. He tormented poor Lucrezia with terrible scenes of jealousy, and when we, his friends, tried to prove the groundlessness of his suspicions, he would not listen to us. Jealousy has become his mania. When their baby was born, we decided that now he would finally calm down. And at first it looked exactly like that. But in fact, he only learned to hide his suspicion, and one day terrible news reached us. Our friend had an attack of violence. He shouted and stamped his feet, and then snatched the child from the cradle, and disappeared with him in an unknown direction. All our searches have come to nothing. It was said that he and Mohammed Darasheko were seen at one of the railway stations. A few years later, a message came from Italy. There was found the mutilated corpse of a foreigner named Tom Sharnock, who had often been seen together with a child and a man of Oriental appearance. Darasheko and the child disappeared without a trace. Wherever we've been looking, it's all to no avail. And now I don't believe that the inscription on this farce can have anything in common with that Asian. On the other hand, the unusual name of Congo Brown, I am haunted by the thought that Thomas Sharnock has repeatedly mentioned him before. But Mohammed Darasheko was a Persian of very noble origin and possessed amazing knowledge in many fields of science. What does he have in common with the wax cabinet? Maybe Congo Brown was his servant and is now speculating on the name of the owner, Sinclair suggested. Perhaps. We need to find out everything. I wouldn't be surprised if I found out that he inspired Tom Sharnock with the idea of stealing his own child and maybe even helped to carry it out. He hated Lucrezia with all his soul. From some words she accidentally dropped, I concluded that he constantly harassed her, but she rejected him. Although, apparently, there should have been another, much more terrible reason that gave rise to such an unusual thirst for revenge. Darasheko. But I can't get a word out of Lucretia anymore. She starts to worry terribly, almost faints, as soon as I touch on this topic. Darasheko has become a real demon of this family. Thomas Sharnock completely submitted to his will and more than once confessed to us that he considers the Persian to be the only living being initiated into the terrible mysteries of some ancient art. For the sake of some completely incomprehensible goals of his own, he allegedly could divide a person into separate parts, which at the same time remained alive. Naturally, we did not believe this, considering Tom an inventor and a visionary, and Darasheko a disgusting charlatan, but we could not find irrefutable evidence in any way. It seems the show is starting. The Egyptian lights the lights around the tent. The issue of Fatima the Pearl of the East had just ended. The audience was strolling around the tent, or through the small windows made in the red cloth walls. They viewed a roughly drawn panorama of the capture of Delhi. Others stood silently over the glass coffin with the dying Turk. He was barely breathing, his chest was pierced by a cannonball, the edges of the wound were scorched and blackened. When the wax figure lifted its heavy eyelids, the soft rasp of the springs of the mechanism could be heard from the box. Some spectators even put their ears to the glass to hear better. The motor at the entrance was running slower. Now it was used to set in motion a musical instrument similar to a hurdy-gurdy. The mournful creaking sounds of the confused music seemed both loud and deaf at the same time. There was something unusual, lingering in them, as if they were coming from underwater. The tent reeked of wax and the soot of kerosene lamps. Number 311. Quote O Bavanga, I will have enchanted heads, Sinclair read in his program, examining together with Zibaldus a glass case with 3 severed human heads that looked extremely plausible, gaping mouths, staring eyes, and made the most disgusting impression. You know, they're not made of wax. They're real. Albrecht exclaimed in surprise and took a magnifying glass out of his pocket. It is unclear only how they were dissected. Surprisingly, the entire surface of the cut on the neck is covered with skin, or it has fused. But I don't see a single seam. It all looks as if they have grown on their own, like pumpkins in a garden, and have never been on a person's shoulders. If only I could lift the lid. All wax, yes, live wax, yes, dead heads too expensive and smell like. The Egyptian's voice suddenly rang out behind them. He stealthily crept up behind them, his face twitched as if he was trying his best to hold back a smile. The friends exchanged frightened glances. I hope he didn't hear anything, because just a second ago we were talking about Darasheko, Sinclair said after a short silence. I wonder if Drive Cruiser will be able to question Fatima, otherwise we'll have to invite her to a bottle of wine in the evening. He still continues to talk to her on the street. At that moment the music stopped, the gong sounded, and a shrill female voice was heard from behind the curtain. Vayu and Dhananjaya, magnetic twins of 8 years old, are the most amazing wonder of the world. They're singing. The spectators crowded into the far corner of the tent, where the podium was arranged. Dr. Cruiser approached his friends and stopped Sinclair by the sleeve. I found out everything, he whispered. The Persian lives in Paris under a false name. Here is his address. He surreptitiously showed them a tiny piece of paper. By the next train to Paris. Vayu and Dhananshaya, they sing. The shrill female voice announced again. The curtain swung open, and a terrible-looking creature, dressed as a page, with some kind of bundle in his hands, walked unsteadily onto the stage. A walking drowned man dressed in multicolored velvet and gold lace. A wave of disgust swept through the crowd. He was as tall as an adult, and his face was still a child. The face, arms, legs, the whole body, even the fingers, were somehow inexplicably enlarged in size. It seemed like he was just blown up like a rubber ball. The skin on the lips and hands was colorless, almost transparent, as if there was air or water under it. The eyes were empty, without the slightest signs of thought. He looked around helplessly. "I'm the eldest Pratt," explained a female voice with a strange accent, and from behind the curtain, with a violin in her hand, came a hefty aunt in a trainer's costume and red polished boots trimmed with fur. "Vayu," she repeated once more, pointing with her bow at the child. Then she opened the notebook and read out in a loud voice. The greatest miracle of the world. Twins of 8 years old. One and the other are connected by an invisible umbilical cord. The length is 3 cubits. If you cut off one, the other will also die. A mystery for all scientists. I think he's developed. Far beyond his age. But mentally retarded. Dhananshaya, on the contrary, is very smart, but small. Like a newborn. He was born without skin, now he can't grow. Sitting in a bubble with warm water, parents unknown. The greatest miracle of nature. She gave Vi a sign, and he began to slowly unwrap the bundle in his hands. From there appeared a small, fist-sized head with tiny prickly eyes. A face covered with a network of bluish veins, the face of a baby, with the grimace of an old man, distorted with such contemptuous hatred, filled with such malice and so vicious that a groan escaped the audience. "My brother D.D. Dhananshaya," the puffed-up creature said with difficulty, and again stared helplessly at the audience. "God Almighty! Get me out of here immediately, or I'll fall," Melchior Cruiser whispered. Under the gaze of the Egyptian, they took their barely-alive friend out into the street. The woman at this time took out a violin, and from the tent her singing and the hollow voice of the pouting Vayu humming a song could be heard. There was a mine of goods, a Vanasi glug in trouble. The baby, unable to pronounce the words, screamed out only vowels in a shrill, heart-rending voice. "Iuiaoriieyuiher." Dr. Cruiser, leaning on Sinclair's arm, was gasping for air. Applause was heard from the tent. "That's Sharnock's face." "What a terrible resemblance," groaned Melchior Cruiser, "but how this can be, I don't understand. Everything swam before my eyes, I felt that I was about to fall. Zabaldus, please call a car." I immediately appealed to the authorities. "We need to act, and you both go to Paris. Mohammed Darasheko. Grab him while he's still there." Again, the two friends were sitting by the window in a small wine cellar and watched Melchior Cruiser hurriedly walking towards them down the street. "It's just like back then," Sinclair said. "How stingy fate can sometimes be with variety." The door slammed, and Dr. Cruiser entered the tavern. His friends shook his hand. "And now we are waiting for your report, Dr. Cruiser," Zabaldus Obrit said after Sinclair had completed his detailed account of 2 months of unsuccessful searches for the Persian in Paris. "You didn't write us almost anything. At that time I was simply unable to write, however, as well as to speak," Melchior Cruiser apologized. "It's like I've aged since then. The constant movement at random among new puzzles is much more exhausting than it might seem. Few people understand what a person feels, doomed to carry the burden of an unsolved mystery on his shoulders all his life, and to be a daily witness of the attacks of despair of the unfortunate Lucretia. As I have already written, she recently died of grief and longing. Congo Brown escaped from a pre-trial prison, and with his escape, the last threads that could lead us to a solution were broken. Someday I will definitely tell you everything in detail, but not now. The memories are still too fresh and hurt too much." "Haven't you found a single clue?" Sinclair asked. "Everything that was revealed was so incredible that our forensic doctors could not or did not want to believe it. They called it dark superstitions, lies, hysterical hallucinations, and yet many facts are horrifying in their evidence. The first thing I did was rush to the police, and they were all arrested." Congo Brown admitted that he had received the twins, and indeed his entire panopticon, as a gift for some services from Mohammed Darasheko. Vayu and Dhananshaya were artificially created beings that the Persian made 8 years ago from one child, Tom Sharnock's child, without disturbing his vital activity. He simply divided the magnetic currents possessed by any living being and then, using additional material taken from animals, managed to get two whole bodies from one body, which are at different levels of development and have different physical properties. According to Congo Brown, Darasheko possessed the secrets of some magical art. Oberwang's heads are also the result of his experiments, and they used to be alive for a long time. This was confirmed by Fatima, the mistress of Congo Brown, and all the others, who, as it turned out, had nothing in common with the villain. Fatima also said that Congo Brown was an epileptic. During certain phases of the moon he fell into a state of unusual excitement and identified himself with Muhammad Darasheko. At the same time, his heart stopped and his breathing stopped, and his facial features changed, so that everyone who knew Darasheko, and they had often seen him in Paris before, was sure that it was really him. In addition, in this state, Congo Brown possessed an irresistible magnetic force. Without uttering a word, he could make any person repeat any gestures and twists. It was as if the people around them were being attacked by the dance of Saint Vitus, which they could not resist. Congo Brown had no equal in flexibility. He perfectly mastered all the unusual poses of dervishes, with the help of which, as they say, it is possible to cause mysterious phenomena, and the movement of consciousness the Persian personally taught him. These tricks were so difficult that they could not be repeated by any acrobat in the world, even from those who which are called snake man. Traveling from town to town with the wax cabinet, Congo Brown allegedly used his magnetic power at times to train boys on such acrobatic snakes. Most of them, however, broke their backs as a result of his exercises, while the rest of them had too strong an effect on the brain, so that the poor devils forever became idiots. Listening to Fatima's confessions, our doctors, of course, only shook their heads, but later something happened that probably still made them think. Congo Brown disappeared directly from the interrogation through the next room, and the investigator said that just as he was about to start recording the testimony of the black man, he suddenly stared at him, gesticulating strangely. Suspecting something was wrong, the investigator wanted to call for help, but his body was already numb, his tongue somehow twisted out. Now he can no longer describe it. This condition, apparently, primarily affects the tongue, and then fell unconscious. Has it been possible to find out anything about how Muhammad Darasheko divided the child into two parts, without depriving him of his life? Zibaldus interrupted. No, Doctor. Cruiser shook his head. But I often remember what Tom Charnock told me about. Human life is something completely different than we think, he said more than once. It consists of various magnetic currents circulating both inside and outside our body, and those scientists who claim that a person cannot live without skin due to lack of oxygen are deeply mistaken. The substance that our skin receives from the air is not oxygen at all, but a kind of fluidum. Rather, the skin does not receive it, but serves only as a kind of lattice that provides it with surface tension. Like a metal grate, if it is lowered into soapy water, each individual cell will be covered with a soap bubble. The spiritual qualities of a person also depend on the predominance of some currents over others, he said. So, for example, if there is too much of one of them, then there is a character so vicious and depraved that we cannot even imagine such a thing. Melchior was silent for a moment, lost in his thoughts. And when I remember the disgusting nature of the dwarf Nanche, which, however, at the same time served as his source of life, I realize with horror that this theory may not be so far from the truth. You sound like the twins are dead, Sinclair said. Are they dead? A few days ago. And it's for the best. The liquid in which one of them spent most of his day had evaporated, and its composition was unknown. Melchior Cruiser stared straight ahead, motionless. There were many other things, he began with a tremor in his voice, unimaginable, monstrous, nightmarish. Thank God that Lucrezia will never find out, she has already had a lot. The poor thing had only to look at the terrible forked creature once, as she immediately collapsed dead. Her maternal feeling seemed to split into two halves. Let me finish for today. As soon as I think about Bayou and Denonshire, I feel like I'm starting to go crazy. He muttered something under his breath, then suddenly jumped up and shouted. Pour me some wine. I don't want to think about it anymore. Immediately, something else. Music, anything just not to think about it. Music. He rushed to the lacquered jukebox against the wall and dropped a coin. Ding. She flew down. There was a hiss. The first chords of the song sounded, muffled at first, then louder. A moment later, the room was filled with a rattling voice. I had a comrade, a most faithful friend in trouble.